Right, I should say I come from an engineering background, so I don't know a great deal about communication, though I spent half my life doing it, probably doing it badly. But I do engage a lot of my social science colleagues who have quite different views as to how we should communicate these sets of issues. And I regularly hear sort of responses after I've spoken that that's too terrifying, it takes away agency from us. And other people find it very uplifting. So I don't think there is a way of getting it across that's appropriate. I don't think there is a narrative. I think there are a whole suite of different ways and narratives, and different people have to engage in their own personal way of getting the message across to others. So this is the approach I'll be taking. You'll see today is the old conventional PowerPoints and numbers and graphs and all that sort of stuff, which I love, but clearly it's failed for the last 25 years. But I still carry on doing it. But there are other, whether it becomes mime or whatever it might be, we may use to communicate, we have to find other ways of getting this message out, which are very different to this. But this is the approach I take. It's comfortable for me, even though the message isn't very comfortable. So I've called this here the streaking emperor, which you will be familiar with. The metaphor. This is really where we are on mitigation. We're pretending we're doing something about it. We see the emperor running past in front of us. Everyone knows they're naked. None of us are prepared to call out and say, look, we're doing nothing. We're all pretending one way or another by one delusion or the other, whether it's emissions trading scheme or offsetting or geoengineering now. There's always some clothes that we pretend the emperor's wrapped in. So I'm going to start it off. Someone was asking about this yesterday. Actually, there's a quote I took just quite recently, having read and listened to Richard Feynman on the Space Shuttle Commission after the '86 Challenger accident. And this was taken from that. And I just think it captures what's happening, I think, in climate science at the moment and its engagement with the policymakers very well. For successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. And I would suggest that that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to fool nature and fool ourselves because we don't like the implications of actually what our analysis is telling us. And I'll come back to that later. Just as a backdrop to Paris, I always think it's really, before you start discussing something, I think it's really important to remind ourselves where we are today. And I'm not sure that many of us are prepared yet, and including myself in this, to really accept where we are now before we start to think about, well, where have we got to go? What do we need to do? There's no point talking about the future, as many people do, without thinking about where are we now. So I'm just going to use I think it's just 3 points on here. The first is that really nothing has changed on climate change from a mitigation point of view since the first IPCC report came out in 1990. So we've had a quarter of a century of complete and utter inaction and abject failure on climate change. And I think we should remind ourselves first of that. I always think we should perhaps hold our head down with a bit of shame that is what we are handing on to other people. And actually this group here, you all look like you were probably here 25 years ago. But sometimes when I'm giving a talk, everyone in the room was not born when the first IPCC report came out. So right throughout their lives, we, their parents, the leaders in their societies, we've all failed them. And that's quite a message. You think, everyone here, not in this room, but sometimes when you're talking, was born after the first IPCC report. And yet since then, the emissions this year will be 60% higher than they were in 1990, 60% higher. Now this is during a time of concern and with all the scientific knowledge at our fingertips, everything we needed to know. And the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is at higher than it's been for 800,000 years. And that's at least, I mean, some people say it's 5 million years, some people say probably nearer 20 million years. But either way, even at 800,000 years, that's 3 times longer than any of us have been on the planet. Not individually, but as a species. So things are in a very unprecedented state. We've never been where we are. And we're not really yet prepared to accept quite where we are today and the scale of our failure and the dynamics of our failure, let alone try to think what the responses may be. So this is one of our responses to the challenge that we're facing now. This is the Paris document. Some of you were there, I gather. Who was at Paris? No, I don't mean just wondering when. I actually mean the event. Okay, yeah. So I asked that once. A lot of people put their hand up. Oh, I didn't know. Amazing, all these people went there. They thought it meant just went to Paris for a weekend, doesn't it? But, yeah. So this is the event. So good. It's nice to know that quite a few were there. And did you read the various texts that came out? There were 3 different drafts. Did you look at those drafts? Some of you might have done. Well, there are 3 different drafts that came out of the text. And I think it's important to say the final one, it was a real diplomatic triumph. And we have to be positive about it in the ways that we need to be positive about it when it is appropriate. It was a diplomatic triumph. It could have gone like Copenhagen. But there was a very high buy-in from all leaders, 195 member states have signed up to it. I think the other thing is that in some respects, it sort of put two fingers up to the skeptics. And I think that, or at least certainly the denialists, but to some extent the skeptics. Now that is a really strong message, that for once, the leaders of the world came together and said, we basically believe the science. Now, we don't believe we have to do anything about it, but we believe the science. And I think that was a huge triumph and very significant credit to the French for driving this through. They were very busy behind the scenes trying to make sure everyone did as they were supposed to do and sign this thing. So I think it was a triumph. And I personally think this, so from 2 points of view. One, that we got every leader to effectively say that they believe the science. But the second is this paragraph here, which I'll zoom in on there. So this is what the paragraph here. To hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C, the well below being really important there, above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts for 1.5 degrees C. It's quite hard when people on both sides, but anyway. So the other thing it said here, to undertake rapid reductions in accordance with the best science. Now that was not there in the penultimate text. That was removed from it was in the first text, not in the penultimate text. And then quite a lot of us argued vehemently that along with quite a few other things, should be in the final text. That went back in and nothing else went back in. But I think that is quite important that it has that in there, because you can then refer back to the IPCC and things like the carbon budgets, because there was no reference to carbon budgets anywhere within the Paris Agreement. But it also says on the basis of equity and with efforts to eradicate poverty, and that is also very important to ensure that that's in there. So the important parts are well below 2 degrees C, arguably 1.5, though I think that was very much just a sop to the poorer parts of the world, to be honest. Nevertheless, I think we can still hold our leaders to account because they signed up for it, based on the best science, and I think the equity parts are really important. And that does allow us in wider civil society to push our leaders, whether that's in companies or governments, or in our case at the moment in Manchester in the university, to actually abide by what we've signed up to. But there are lots of issues with the Paris Agreement. So there's no reference, remember it's an agreement about climate change, there's no reference to fossil fuels throughout 32 pages, no reference to decarbonisation in a document about climate change, which just seems ridiculous that those things that were pushed out. As I understand it, this was because of the Saudis, but I'm sure every country had its thing it wanted pushing out of there. Aviation and shipping were exempt, so they're not included. They were, I think, in one of the early texts. I'm pretty sure they were in the early text. The voluntary pledges that underpinned it, the INDCs, there's a lot of discussion about them being at 2.7 degrees centigrade, that was the temperature. But actually that already assumes lots of negative emissions, which I'll talk about later. So that is already a scam. And the people who produced the 2.7 Carbon Action Tracker and others knew that it was a scam. But they were prepared to hold to that. Actually, if you just look at the INDCs, and you have to make a lot of assumptions around it about them anyway, because they all stop in 2030, the pledges. There's no pledge as to what's going to happen after 2030. There are some conditional pledges by a few countries, but by and large, it all stops in 2030. You have to make some assumptions, but it's much more in line with the 3.5 degrees C future. There's no review, and you can measure time in two ways here. You can measure it chronologically or in terms of billions and tons. And in my view, there's no review of the INDCs for another 200 billion tons. By the time we review them, we'll have put out another 200 billion tons of CO2. So that's well over, in fact, it's about 25% of the remaining budget for a likely chance of 2 degrees C between now and when we actually review the INDCs. And that should have been, a lot of us argued we should be reviewing them every 2 years. So we should have a much, much more rapid review process. It's very completely reliant on negative emission technologies, but I'm going to come back to that later. And I think this is quite interesting. There's the 100 billion per annum to help with adaptation and mitigation of the poorer parts of the world. And when you say that quickly, it sounds like quite a lot, 100 billion per annum. But that's the subsidy to fossil fuels. This is according to the IMF, which is not really a left-wing think tank. The IMF came up and said that the subsidy, the direct and indirect subsidy, now a significant chunk of that is actually the indirect health effects, less so the climate change effects, the indirect health effects of fossil fuels, which governments have to, of course, cover the costs of. But the subsidy to fossil fuels is $5.3 trillion, or it was in 2015. That's 53 times more than we're going to give the poorer parts of the world to adapt and respond to climate change. So I just think it shows you somehow, to some extent, that 100 billion is just a crumb, and we should remind ourselves that's all it is. It's just a payoff to the poor parts of the world. It's about 1/30 of the UK GDP that we're going to give to the rest of the world to deal with climate change. So it's a paltry sum. And I think that is a really sad, and that we argued about it, I think is really quite sad, that actually the debate was set by someone else. Let's argue, should it be 90 or 110,000? 110 million, it's an irrelevant sum. It should have been in the trillions. So before Paris, we were on this sort of path, which you're probably all fairly familiar with, and heading probably towards 4 to 6 degrees C temperature rise by the end of the century. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty. We have to be careful not to be too precise about these things, because there's a lot of uncertainty about climate sensitivity. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the higher temperature thresholds, much more certainty about the lower temperature thresholds. But so we were heading broadly in that direction. That's the INDCs. The INDCs have us at about 3.5. And remember, they all stop. The INDCs basically say what the emissions will be from different parts of the world between 2020 and 2030. That's really all they are. That's our pledges. That's all. Just between 2020 and 2030. They're not measured in the same units. Actually, they have slightly different start dates. They have different baseline dates. Some are measured in GDP, emissions per unit of GDP, so carbon intensity. Others are measured in absolute change. So it's a complete ad hoc collection of random numbers handed out by countries that we've tried to bring together and make some sort of sense of. But that's been fairly optimistic that it's in that sort of direction. And that does assume continued effort after 2030. And they say there's no country's bought into that. But that's what we're aiming at. That's 2 degrees C. And you start to look at the gap between them. I mean, OK, it's not as bad as the gap before, but it's still a huge void between those two. And the argument that I've made, and the one that has the big political repercussions, and actually from a communication point of view I think is really challenging to get across, is that you have to do something here, which is very unpopular. That in the short term, you cannot build your way out of the problem. You have to reduce energy demand, dramatically reduce energy demand. And when I say that, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying we expect the poor people in our own society or in other parts of the world to reduce their use of energy. I expect their use of energy to go up, and I want their use of energy to go up. That means their emissions will go up in the short term. That means the rest of us have to have dramatic changes in how much energy we consume. Those of us already are the major emitters. Have I got this? Yeah, I think I've got some slides later on about that, hopefully. So, but that has big political repercussions. It's also worth bearing in mind that this is all the graph here. These are global, and we've signed up on the basis of equity. Now, quite what that means is hard to discern quantitatively. But what we have signed up to is that the poorer parts of the world will peak their emissions. Their global emissions will go up and then peak at a later date than ours. Now, ours are broadly peaked. In the wealthy parts of the world, we've been roughly static for probably 5 to 7 years now in our carbon dioxide emissions, though not necessarily from our consumption-based emissions. If you look at how we lived our lives, those emissions are probably still going up. But if you look at it purely from a territorial basis, we're probably about static. Though remember, the territorial does not include aviation and shipping, both of which have been going up very significantly. In the UK, aviation and shipping emissions are somewhere between 14 to 15% of our carbon dioxide emissions that are not accounted for. I'm not sure who accounts for them, God or someone. But they don't belong to any particular country, apparently. And we're not going to belong to any country again because they're not, again, in the Paris Agreement. So we again let them off. So this is on the basis of equity. So let's go back to the carbon budgets. Say if any of this is not clear, just call out. If there's anything it's not obvious what I'm saying, or if I'm teaching my grandma to suck eggs and you know all this stuff and I can speed up, just let me know. Within 5 to 8 years, at current global emissions are around about 36 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide every single year from energy alone, about 40 billion tonnes of CO2 if you include deforestation and so forth as well. So 36 billion tonnes. Just think about what that means. That's about it's about about 7 tonnes per person. So we have more CO2 emissions per person than we have waste. So you think everything we throw away, our mass of CO2 emissions are more than our mass of other things that we throw out. And yet we dump that in the atmosphere without thinking about it all the time. But at current emission rates, within 5 to 8 years, we'll have wiped out the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's for not a particularly good chance of it. So when we put in 1.5 degrees C within the Paris Agreement, we were already having to make assumptions, either that no one would check the maths, and that the poor parts of the world would simply be happy that we've put this number in, or that we're going to be able to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at some point in the future to avoid us having to take any action today. So you think about this, in 5 years from now, that's just after we review the INDCs. We'll have swamped that budget. There'll be virtually no budget left by the time we review the INDCs for 1.5 degrees C. And yet that was enshrined in the Paris Agreement, and not many people have spoken about it since. For 2 degrees C, and I can go through this, I haven't put in all the slides behind this for for today. I've tried to keep this talk a bit shorter. But it's very clear that the 66% chance, a good chance of 2 degrees C, and that's interesting as well, a good chance, just the language we use, a likely chance. Often we use the word, I've used the word good, other people use the word likely, of 2 degrees C. 2 degrees C is already recognised to be dangerous. That's why one of the reasons we're going for 1.5, and even 1.5 is dangerous. So at 2 degrees C, many people will die. They'll be poor, generally non-white, and living a long way away from here, by and large. But at 2 degrees C, many people will die. And then we call a 66% chance of that a good chance of something that's anyway dangerous. Would you accept that on a flight? You would never accept that in your life that was dangerous, would you? If you go out on your motorbike for the weekend, would you accept a 66% chance you don't have a crash? You would never accept that. And yet here we're just playing with the planet. We don't have another one we can go to. If one person dies, if a plane crashes, it's all very sad. But there's still lots of people aren't on the plane. In this case, we're all 7 billion are on this particular plane. And yet we're prepared to accept that. In fact, we're not. That's got no chance anymore. We have no chance we no longer have a good chance of 2 degrees C. The 50-50 chance of 2 degrees C, if you look at the carbon budgets for that, even across the full range, they're very, very small, the carbon budgets. And unless we actually recognise now, or preferably a little bit in the past, that climate change, if you took a sort of warlike metaphor, I'm not sure it's a helpful metaphor, but if you think of it like that, we'd have to have that level of engagement at a global level that we could just about give us a 50-50 chance of 2 degrees C. That's not going to happen. I mean, are your elections here, were they full of discussions of climate change? No. They're not in the UK, nowhere in the world are they. So therefore that's gone, so that's blown. So the best chance we have now is an outside chance of avoiding killing too many people in other parts of the world. So it's a fairly sad indictment that we're now down to this. And yet when you hear people talk about Paris and around it, you hear lots of upbeat sort of rhetoric, particularly if you get involved in Twitter, as I discovered. So that's sort of a global perspective, but you really think, well, what's that really mean for us? If you're a politician in Ireland with the election, or one in the UK now discussing the EU, you need to know what this mean for our particular domain. What does that mean for the wealthy parts of the world? Well, a very simple method here, requiring no fancy IAM modelling processes or anything like that at all. We have a global carbon budget for a reasonable chance, or an outside chance of 2 degrees C. So we have a carbon budget. Now, there are a range of carbon budgets. You can use the full range. The analysis the conclusions don't really change. I use the headline budget from the synthesis report if anyone wants to check the numbers. So the synthesis report has a table in there, table 2.2, and I use those figures. There's a recent, quite useful paper, useful and not very useful paper. It's badly written, but it's in Nature Climate Change, just came out just recently, was it last week? 2 weeks ago it was now, which is a revamp of some of the numbers in the IPCC synthesis report. It's worth having a browse through it. But the numbers actually are slightly harder, slightly tighter than they were in the synthesis report. But if we know that budget from the IPCC, we can estimate for the poorer parts of the world, we can make various estimates as to what their emissions would be if we assumed things about when they would peak their emissions, what their rates of reductions would be. We can make an estimate then of that carbon budget, and we simply do a bit of maths, subtracting that one, the 2 from 1, and you have what's left for us, the rich parts of the world. Simple bit of maths. So let's assume the poor parts of the world peak their emissions by 2025. Now this was initially, when I used to talk about this, sounded ridiculously early. I think now this is sounding very doable. The poor parts of the world, their emissions are dominated by China. Effectively, the poor parts of the world, whatever China does, the aggregate of the poor parts of the world will be roughly that. Because the other parts of the world, even if India, which is still a very significant emitter, even if India peaks a lot later, and if China peaked around about 2025, that would still be the average, much nearer to 2025. It's so dominant. But that looks now just about viable. The Chinese said, I think, in Paris about 2030, the Indians were nearer 2040, and many poor parts of the world had no sense of when they would peak their global emissions. But I think 2025 is viable. Some people are saying there's an LSE report just come out. Have any of you seen that one? Just in the last few days, saying that they're saying they think we could have peaked already. Then you look at the detail, that's the headline. The detail is that, by they mean already, within the coming 10 years. So that would be that sort of time frame. So there are other people now saying something similar to this. But the other part is, so that's the thing is now entering sort of common discourse. But the next part really isn't. If you then had to have them reduce their emissions by 2035 by 10% every single year, that's 3 times faster than Stern says is possible with economic growth. So that is a huge challenge. So if you think your economy is growing at 3% per annum, that's a 13% improvement in your carbon intensity every single year. So that's a huge request. And that would mean they have to fully decarbonise their energy system by 2050. Every facet of the energy would be zero carbon. And we also have to remember that for climate change temperatures to stabilise, we have to have zero carbon energy, not low carbon energy. Low carbon energy means the temperatures keep going up. And so it's quite a difference when we talk about these things. That does colour which technologies are viable. So we have to have zero carbon energy. That's particularly important, as you're probably fairly aware in Ireland, is because the agricultural emissions are quite hard to bring down. And so we will always have agricultural emissions of greenhouse gases, whatever we do. And we can make them we can have them much lower than they are now, but we can never eliminate the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but we can eliminate them from energy. So if we did all of that slide there, we did all of this, we work out the emissions underneath the curve, a fairly straightforward calculation. You can then see what's left for, I thought it said Iceland then for a minute, Ireland, yes, I couldn't read it from here. So what's left for the wealthy parts of the world? And we would have to have at least a 10% per annum reduction rate starting now, and preferably starting a few years ago. We're redoing this with the latest budgets, and we think it's nearer 13 to 15% per annum. But it's a number that I'm sure that you've heard it regularly during your recent election debates. They've all been saying, yeah, we'll have no problem with 10% per annum. No one's been discussing it at all, have they? So 10% every year starting from now. And to give a sense as to what that means, as to this is fundamentally different to what we normally get to hear. That's about roughly a 50% reduction in emissions by 2020 rather, roughly, there or thereabouts, depending on a number of factors. About a 75% reduction by 2025, about 90% by 2030. And basically, we need to be aiming to be fully decarbonised. That's everything. Our planes, our ships, our fridges, our cars, our industries, everything by 2035 for an outside chance of 2 degrees C, and 2 degrees C will anyway kill many hundreds of thousands of people elsewhere in the world. So this is the best that we can hope for, and this is what we'd have to deliver. What we've done in the EU, which of course Ireland is a signatory to, is a 40% reduction by 2030. So less than half of what is necessary. And what's disturbing is there are lots of senior scientists have openly supported this position, said that's about right. If you ask them for their numbers, they'll never send them to you, because there are no numbers behind it, only eloquent rhetoric. So how can this be reconciled with the sorts of statements that we often read? Oh, yeah, that's right. This is from Ottoma, the Working Group 3 chair. The Working Group 3 is the mitigation part of the IPCC. I spoke to him last year in Germany. Mitigation costs would be so low that global economic growth would not be strongly affected. I'm going to use now the next one from I apologise, it's from the UK, but I just think it just captures it perfectly. To keep to 2 degrees C, we must cut emissions by at least 80% by 2050. Well, firstly, that's got nothing to do with climate change. The climate does not care about what the reductions are in 2050. It only cares about the carbon budget. And the IPCC this Committee on Climate Change are aware of this. But the next bit is the really important bit, and it would be disbanded, the CCC, if it didn't say this. The good news is that reductions of that size are possible without sacrificing the benefits of economic growth and rising prosperity. We cannot question that. The second law of thermodynamics is subservient to ephemeral political rhetoric. And that is what we've come to normalise in our society now, that politics always trumps physics. In the end, I've got a feeling it'll be the other way around. We have to remember that some of these ideas have only been here for a few decades, as by and large, physics has been here for, 13 billion since the Big Bang, pretty much? So 13 billion years, and you put your money on which one you think is going to win. There are two rabbits in the hat that allow us to reconcile these two irreconcilable positions, in my view. And the first one of these are negative emission technologies, and the most commonly referred to one is something called BECCS, biomass, energy, carbon capture and storage. And by and large, that means growing trees or plants around the world. And as they grow, they absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, all standard stuff. You cut the trees down and you put them into some sort of fuel-chipped form. You transport them all around the world in ships to power stations. And it's worth bearing in mind in the UK alone that 50% of the shipping coming, or 50% of the mass of goods coming into the UK are fossil fuels by shipping, 50%. And if you then went to say you wanted biomass would have at best half the energy intensity of fossil fuels. You'd have to double the amount of shipping just coming to the UK just to bring the fuel to the UK, for instance. And no one does that analysis in the models. The models don't have that part in there. They just ignore that. So you've got to take it to all the power stations around the world. You have to burn it in the power stations, which of course we can do all of these bits individually. You capture the carbon dioxide from the chimney, from the flue. At least you capture some of it. You almost liquefy it, you don't, you compress it to it's almost a liquid, it's on a phase change state, and then you pump it underground and store it there for a few thousand years. Now that's what we're aiming to do for an outside chance of 2 degrees C. This has never worked at scale, and when you talk to some of the modelers, say, well, there's a planet working somewhere, and they say it's 2 megawatts. You think, 2 megawatts? We've got to generate 105,000 terawatt hours of energy, so it's a completely different ballgame. You can't just scale it up from some little experiment in the lab. We've had fusion for years, really. I mean, fusion reactions have been held for a second, but you wouldn't think of putting a fusion reactor into your energy scenarios of the future. Oh, we've had a fusion reactor, it's held for a second. Yeah, but it's got to hold for 40 years. So it seems ridiculous to me to argue, just because we can do these bits at very small scales, we automatically assume they can be scaled up. So never worked to scale. There are huge technical economic unknowns. I mean, simple things like biomass is not homogeneous like most fossil fuels. So you put it into a burner, and you have loads of different chemicals in there, and that will change what happens to the catalyst, the scrubbers that remove the CO2. So lots of sort of boring technical stuff are really important in there. There's a huge efficiency penalty. So you take a power station running at 35 to 55% efficient. You bolt on a big bit of grunting kit at the back of it. So it's not a sophisticated, elegant solution. You just bolt a big bit of kit on the back, and you filter out the CO2. You also take about 15 to 25% energy penalty in doing that. So it makes the system even more inefficient than it already is. You've got limited biomass availability. You've got 9 billion people to feed by 2050, maybe 9.7 according to the UN. You've got aviation sector, so it's going to be flying its planes on biomass. They've got the shipping sector, thinks it's going to be using biomass. We're already 7%, or 5 to 7%, I think, is of EU cars are driven on the fuel we buy is biomass. And then you've got the chemical industry thinking it wants to use biomass as a feedstock. And you're on a round planet. So you sort of think, well, that's quite a challenge. And you have to assume that the feedbacks, like the melting of the permafrost is the obvious one, they're not going to kick in before you've got this technology up and running at scale. And remember what you're trying to do here. You're trying to absorb huge quantities of CO2 from the atmosphere, not a little bit, huge quantities, and give some sense of what that looks like. This is the equivalent. This is the IPCC models, pretty much all of them adopt this. And they all have somewhere between 1 and 3 times the size of India planted out. That's a huge part of the planet. Now, when we say India, I know in Britain we probably think it is India because we're sort of colonialists. So, but it's just to give an example of the area. It wouldn't have to be India. I'm sure that's what we think if you ask the Conservatives. And we have to do it year after year, decade after decade. You're going to have to store hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 somewhere reliable underground. And that's not without some sort of fairly major technical issues trying to do that. We really don't know how to do that. We know quite a lot about the oil and gas reservoirs, but we don't know about when you put CO2 in the saline aquifers, is where we're thinking about putting them. We already know that there's some suggestion that it starts to break up the rock forms at the surface of the aquifers. And you have to store it there for a few thousand years securely. You can't be leaking. So that's what we're doing, rather than finding ways to drive around without having a ton of steel to move 70 kilograms of flesh 6 miles to buy a paper. And that's the more obvious one that we should do. The other one, we have to peak global emissions in the past, which sounds almost like flippant, doesn't it? What do we peak in the past? We haven't got a time machine. We don't have one of these, and Doctor Who might have one, but as far as I'm aware, there's not one in reality as yet. And yet, if you go to I'll go back to his quote first. Yeah, sorry, I should use this. So I think if you think about all of that, and you go back to Feynman's quote, think, the Paris is based on this. The Committee on Climate Change in the UK, its advice to government is based on negative emissions, even though the 5th Carbon Budget report handed to government recently only makes one reference to it in a footnote. So no one is prepared to be honest about it. It's nowhere mentioned in the Paris Agreement. You have to discern it from the few numbers that are in there. So we are trying to fool nature. And just to show that I'm not, it sounds ridiculous to say we're going to use BECCS at this scale and that we're going to go back in past, we're going to travel back in time. These are the IPCC scenarios that informed the recent AR5. 400 of those scenarios for 50% chance or better of 2 degrees C, there were 400 scenarios. Of those, 86% assume you've got negative emissions. So almost all of them assume you've got negative emissions. The other 14% assume you peak emissions globally in 2010. Now, it's ridiculous, isn't it? The situation we're in. But what's most disturbing, and I had to put many here, I think the number is probably about 70 to 80%, but the significant number of the scenarios assume both negative emissions and time travel. This is the IPCC. If you look at the UNEP gap report, I gave a seminar at the Committee on Climate Change in the UK recently, and during the seminar, I was asked, why are my numbers different from their numbers? I said, well, what are yours based on? They told me that ours are based on the UNEP gap report. Have any of you come across the UNEP gap report? It's quite a well-known report. And it's influential, very influential, too influential. But it's the basis of the UK Committee on Climate Change's advice to government. That has 163 scenarios in there, of which 183, of which 163, I think, are at peak emissions in 2010. All the others use negative emissions. 3/4 of all the scenarios that underpin the Committee on Climate Change advice to the UK government and what the carbon budget should be assume both negative emissions and a peak in global emissions in 2010. So, it may sound flippant, but this is what's actually quantitatively informing our thinking about climate change. And we are not prepared to be honest about it. We just hide behind long words with lots of syllables and don't look at the maths. So Paris, some academics and politicians, rather than focus on urgent and deep mitigation now, with hugely challenging and political repercussions, and we can sort of see why. I mean, you can't help but feel sorry for them. The idea that this is what they're having to deal with. And sorry for ourselves, because we're in the same, we're all supportive of this regime. Huge political repercussions. We are going to rely on non-existent negative emission technologies to suck CO2 out of the air sometime when we're dead and buried, at least some of us anyway. So that's what we do. That's what we're handing on to the next generation. I put these slides in quickly this morning. They're slightly old now, but I think this is quite important. This is a colleague of mine, and actually a friend, and he knows I use this slide. I've used it many times. And so it's a few years ago now. But he said there's too much invested in 2 degrees C. He thinks 2 degrees C is not possible. I'll come at the end and say this. I think it's still a viable option, But this was a few years ago, and he was by then, and quite a lot of people I knew were quietly saying we have no hope for 2 degrees C. So he said too much is invested in 2 degrees C for us to say it's not possible. It would undermine all that we've worked towards. Now, this is a senior political scientist who gives advice regularly to government and writes a lot of very good papers. It'll give a sense of hopelessness. We may as well just give in. And these are all direct quotes, and he knows I use them. And he doesn't object to me to use them as long as I don't mention his name. So I asked him, are you suggesting we have to lie about our research findings? Well, perhaps just be not so honest, more dishonest. Now, that is one academic talking to another academic about how we have to be dishonest about our research findings because we mustn't undermine the 2 degrees C process and rhetoric and political creed. Now, I think if we're doing that amongst our colleagues, how on earth can we expect the policymakers to take these things, not take them seriously, but actually address the problems? Because it's their job to spin things. They have to spin. I mean, some spin's wrong, and other spin, we might argue, they have to deal in the political world. And we don't. We should deal in a world where we're much more robust in our analysis and our conclusions. Senior government advisor. He was a chief scientist in one of the government departments and probably one of the most influential chief scientists we had. He has no doubt about it. We have no doubt about it. We have no hope for 2 degrees C. And he's thought that for about 10 years. We can't tell them, the ministers and politicians, it's impossible. We can say it's a stretch and ambitious, but with political will, 2 degrees C is still a feasible target. Now, I think it is still a feasible target, but he doesn't. And yet he still tells his minister that it's a feasible target. And why get a scientific advisor if the scientific advisor decides to second guess what the minister wants to hear? What's the point of that? You might as well just get a mirror. Much cheaper as well. And this is the minister before one of the COPs. Our position is challenging enough. I can't go with the message that 2 degrees C is impossible. It's what we've all worked towards. So there's a whole sort of industry of us there underpinning this, whether it's academics, whether it's scientific advisors, or whether it's ministers. And actually, I think his position is completely defensible. I think that's a completely reasonable position to hold for the minister. I don't think it's appropriate for the chief scientist or for an academic. But I think I can understand the minister's position there. So we turn to 2 degrees C. Is it still a viable goal? I'm going to whip through this quickly, actually, because I don't want to be rambling on for far too long. Yes, I think it is. I think there are 3 things that we need to be addressing here, only one of which is probably popular, or popular-ish. First one is the equity component. The second one is technology. We always like technology because that means we haven't got to make any changes to our lives. But in this case, the technology is on the demand side, and actually that does have quite a lot of political repercussions. And the final one is the thing we're never allowed to touch. That's more important than physics: growth. You can't question that one. So just touch on these quickly. This is thanks to Chancellor and Piketty for their recent report, and indeed the Oxfam report that came out during the COP, that points out that 50% of global emissions come from 10% of the population. Now, I've been using something similar based on some Italian economist, but just extrapolating it out from sort of theory. But this is based on looking at the data that's available as best they can. It's really worth reading. If you've not read, it's Chancellor and Piketty. It's open access. It's worth reading their report. I think it's called Extreme Carbon Inequality, I think it's called. But it's a good report. And there are different methodologies you can use, which they discuss within that. And the top 1% of US emitters, about 3.5 million people or so, have a carbon footprint that is 2,500 times higher than the bottom 1% globally. So the emissions are hugely skewed. And I don't know if any of you watch things like the Oscars and that sort of rubbish. We had Leonardo DiCaprio, getting up there giving us, did anyone hear this, or speech on climate change? I've had some discussions with a few people about this who think I'm wrong on it. But I think, I wish he wouldn't do it. Thank your mom and your director, but don't pretend you care about the climate. So I was looking at his emissions, and people say, well, his emissions don't matter. I was saying, well, actually, I think his voice matters in a sense, but his voice not from what he says, but from his actions. I don't think flying there in your private jet and then living in your private yacht and so forth, and then saying climate change is important and that we're going to solve it with technology isn't in any way helpful. I think if he lived a life that was broadly in line with what he thinks is important, that would be a really strong message. But he doesn't do that. But actually, I think his emissions are quite important. Because I tried to work out using Piketty's methodology. I extrapolated it out to DiCaprio. I used the Forbes list. He gets £29 million in 2015. That was his income. I don't think he earned it, but that's what he was paid. But he was quite low down the list. If you look at the actors, I mean, there were lots of them way above him. So he's in the sort of bottom sort of 15% of the top 100 paid actors around the globe. So he's not so well paid compared to some of them. But I was then trying to work out what his emissions would be, assuming the Piketty methodology works as you go within that 1%. The sort of 0.001% probably that DiCaprio's in. And that means his emissions are the equivalent to about 900 Americans, about 1,500 Europeans, about 9,000 Africans, and about 90,000 Zimbabweans. That's one person. Now, if you follow the methodology, if it broadly works, and I'm sure there'll be some problems with it not working, and it's not so much the energy he consumes, it's the material goods he consumes. It's the CO2 in the embedded goods. That's what represents most of the CO2 of the very wealthy. And that probably includes professors as well. But not to that sort of level. But 90,000 Zimbabweans. Now, I'm trying to check all these numbers at the moment. So that's the work I'm just doing at the moment. So I start to think, actually, his emissions do matter. And when if you imagine taking the top 100 people and actors in the Forbes list, and here's one of the poorer ones, you start, well, actually, you have to multiply that by another 100. So they start to become quite significant numbers. So the emissions are hugely skewed to a particular group. So equity is very important. Who are they? Well, there's the first group, climate scientists. They're all in the top 1% of emitters, pretty much. Is that true? Are communications specialists in the top 1%? Probably not far off it. If you take a long-haul flight every year or two, and that's usually indicative of the other things that we do in our lives as well. Because remember, the poor don't fly. We like to think the poor fly, and they're the ones that are driving emissions. The average income in people flying out of airports is twice the median average in the country. So we know that's not the case. It's the wealthy flying more often. 2 degrees C is a short-term issue, and this is a problem for communication. It's not an issue about the future. It's an issue about between now and, say, 2025. It's a consumption issue, not a population issue. And this is a real red herring that we're worried about the poor. The poor are not going to make a difference for 2 degrees C. They cannot become wealthy enough in the time frame we have to deal with 2 degrees centigrade. It is a complete red herring to say that population is an issue. It is the people now who consume that are the problem. That's not just in the wealthy parts of the world. That includes 300 million people in China, but not the other billion people in China. So it is about the people who consume today. They are the ones that are the problem. So it's people like us, and it's not a population issue. That's different for 4 degrees C because the carbon budget is much bigger. So if you talk about 4 degrees C future, population is important. Population is important for sustainability reasons, but from a carbon perspective, it's a consumption issue. Technology, I'm only just touching the first one of these, but it holds just the same for the second one. Just to say with cars, a large part of the emissions, I'm sure I haven't checked the numbers for Ireland, I'm sure it's somewhere in that sort of range anyway. But there's over 300 models of cars, despite what VW have been doing to fiddle the data, with 100 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre. Now, if I stand here watching cars going past, actually, they were quite big ones then. Oh, and that one. Actually, I was about to say you're probably about 160 to 170 grams of carbon dioxide for every car driving past here, but going by the last 3, you're probably nearer 200. The Americans are 212 grams per kilometre for the average car being driven. The UK is about 160, 165. Germany a bit more than that. And the new models being sold in the UK and indeed across most of Europe are somewhere between 130 and 140 grams, that sort of range. And yet these are normal petrol and diesel cars. These aren't electric cars or hybrids. normal cars, available at no price premium, that take 3 kiddie seats in the back. They go as fast as everyone else's car can do on normal roads. They look like a normal car. There's nothing different about them, except for their fuel consumption is much less. And we have those available at no price premium. 2/3 of all car travel is travelled by vehicles that are under 8 years old and under. This is across the EU. So just a natural replacement rate with a standard. If you had a maximum CO2 standard, which would be very easy to do, that's just along the lines that we vaguely have within the EU now, that's a fleet mean at the moment, with no additional capital cost, doesn't cost you anything more in your cars, in fact they're slightly cheaper, reduced operating costs, a lot less fuel, identical infrastructure, same petrol stations, same diesel stations, same roads, nothing different at all, same employment, same companies. They make the efficient cars and they make the Clarkson cars. They make both of them. You have a 50 to 70% reduction in emissions from the car fleet in about 10 years, just with the standard. And our politicians won't even do that. No cost, just looks the same. They're worried about the Daily Mail in the UK, and they're worried about Top Gear. We just run scared of a handful of powerful organisations in terms of their voices anyway. The final one, growth. The point I always say here, what really matters, these things matter to us really, don't they? You know, these are the things that matter in life. None of us, if I asked what's the most important thing in your life, none of you would tell me, or maybe a sad person would tell me something that had some material value, but most of you would tell me about your children, or about your parents, or about your friends, or about your hobbies. They're the things that really matter in your lives. And yet, what do economists do? They take all of these things that matter in our lives, this is the rich, heterogeneous world that we live in, where we have lots of things that we value, and we don't compare one with another. They're different things. You don't compare your daughter with your mother. You don't say I love one by so many love units and the other one by slightly more or less love units, do you? That's not how we think of the world. Yet economists think of the world like that. They simply put a price on them all through some dodgy techniques that they use, which we can discuss if you want. So they convert all of these things and everything else into price. And then once you've got a price, you can swap things. You can swap the love for your child or the value of a sunset for a car park, because they've all got the same value. And that's how economics works. And it works fine within things you can put a reasonable value on. But once you start to value things that we're talking about here in terms of climate change, I think it's completely inappropriate to do that. It has no meaningful value. So growth itself has no meaningful value. Measure the things that we think are interesting, if there are measurements for them, and assess on that basis. Don't expect to convert them to a single unit. But the other great thing I think about this is that, regardless of climate change, and it's not because of carbon tax or environmental reasons, the economist economy has stalled. They've cocked it up. The neoclassical market economists, I'm not saying all economists here, it's a particular school of thought of economics that dominates Western thought now, and disturbingly starting to dominate some Eastern thought as well. It's that particular school of thought that has failed to understand its own system. So we're faced now with systemic issues. Neoclassical free market economics, the one that dominate our politics, that is in disarray. It cannot understand the situation that we're in. It has no idea how to solve these problems. There are lots of other schools of economics that may be helpful in this. But also, the approaches it's tried to apply to climate change have failed. Whether it's CDM, whether it's joint implementation, offsetting, the emissions trading scheme, and now geoengineering. They've all fundamentally failed. Our emissions just keep going up. And the only reason they've not gone up, actually, the last couple of years is because of the economic downturn. So we have an unprecedented opportunity to think differently about the world. In the sense of an academic, I say we have a blank piece of paper, which is quite exciting as an academic if you can get some funding, because we're starting from scratch as to how would we resolve these sorts of problems. We don't understand how to resolve system-level problems. So the two things I always bang on about, that sort of, if you are serious about 2 degrees C, we need massive reductions in energy demand by the high emitters now, and it's very much by the high emitters. I'm not saying the poor, by people like us. And we need to have a build program, a sort of a Marshall-style build program of zero carbon energy by 2050. That has to have penetrated the whole energy system. And I think that is actually viable. If you put those two together, I would say the first one of these you could power down by between 50 and 70% and still maintain a pretty good quality of life in wealthy parts of the world. And the second one I think you could deliver if we were prepared to have a Marshall-style build program. It's just worth bearing in mind if you took the top 10% of emitters at a global level, their tonnage is about 25 to 30 tons of carbon dioxide per person. If you just said to that group, we want you to reduce your emissions to the average of Europe, not to a poor level, to the average of Europe. That's all you're asking them to do. That would be a 30% in global reduction in global CO2 emissions. Just ask the wealthy 10% to have emissions the same as the average in Europe, a 30% reduction. Easy, isn't it? You could do that almost overnight. So this is the quote I was finished with. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And that's the role of us in universities, actually, is to imagine different futures. But then that's not enough when you want to feed back to policies. You've got to provide some clarity to that. So you've got to provide, what would that look like in a substantial form for policymakers to engage with? And I had some final thoughts as a non-expert on climate change communication. We broadly accept the science. So I think across the board, there's very little disagreement. It's different if you go to the States, and I don't know quite what the position is in Ireland, but by and large, the science has been accepted, even by a lot of the skeptics. There are only a few denialists out there, and they don't even believe in Darwin. So most of the skeptics would believe now in climate change. But there's a deep reluctance amongst everyone, including the skeptics and including the scientific community, including most of the people who work on climate change, a deep reluctance to acknowledge the implications. That's the big problem. And that's much more challenging than just being the skeptics. The problem is that they're easy to deal with. It's people like us that are the problem. We look at all the scams we try. We try everything under the sun other than action. So we've tried everything we can. Politics and economics continually are seen to trump physics. We continually use politics and economics as if it is something that is immutable. It cannot be changed. And we hear that sort of language all the time. The impacts on the poor, typically non-white, a long way from here, with very little money and very little political influence. So we really don't, if we're blunt about this, and it's a very painful thing to think, we really do not care. We'll send them a percentage of GDP, or probably less than 1% of GDP, to try and deal with the problems. But we don't really care about the poor and vulnerable elsewhere in the world. And yet mitigation is principally, to solve the problems, is principally a problem of our communities, or at least the wealthier people around the globe. And I think there's a real problem here in that there's sort of political expediency has official support, things like the Committee on Climate Change, who I have a lot of respect for, but they will always adjust their message, fine-tune their message to fit with the political orthodoxy, with the political paradigm. They won't give it as it is. So you've got that in some sort of official sense, but you've also got the elites of the climate world, the Al Gores of this world and so forth, or the Nick Sterns of this world. I have a lot of time for Nick Stern, but he continually will support something that is politically expedient. But if you sit with him at a pint of, well, he's not sort of a pint of ale man, he's more of a claret man. If you can have a claret, you can have an ale. But if you sit with him away from a microphone, he will accept broadly what I'm saying here, but won't say it publicly. And there's a repeated recourse to pragmatic and realistic. We hear that language all the time, and I always ask the same question, to whom? Is it realistic for us to cut back on a number of flights? Or is it realistic to ask the 30 million people living on the 1 metre sea level rise strip of the coastal strip of Bangladesh to live with 4 degrees centigrade? Which of those is realistic? Pragmatic and realistic to whom? We only ever think of it in relation to our lives, not in terms of the people who will actually, well, in terms of our lifestyles, actually. We don't think of it in terms of the lives of these other people. So that was it. Thanks very much.
Thought-provoking. The comet is coming, right? So we have to address it. This is the premise to put it in front of us. Okay. Before we go into the responses, are there any? Maybe we have 5 minutes or so for any burning questions, clarification, or perhaps something.
Disagreements, particularly. I like disagreements.
Okay, communication point. I suspect that one among the very many statistics you've used would have stuck with many of us. That is that the carbon footprint of one super-rich actor is equivalent to 900 average Americans, 9,000 average Europeans, 2,000 average Zimbabweans. Okay? But you introduced that little episode by saying you wish DiCaprio hadn't said what he said. Actually, you've gained huge advantage by having DiCaprio say what he said, because you can now make a story about the super-rich. I mean, it's a bit like Bono talking about eradicating world poverty or feeding the poor or whatever. I mean, celebrities actually serve a quite useful purpose, even if they're personally contradictory, by putting things out there. So DiCaprio saying that allowed you to say something that we will take home and pass it on. So, well done, Leonardo.
Yeah, but who listens? So his message is technology solves the problem. And as an engineer, I think technology is part of the solution, but nowhere near enough. But who listens to people like me? I mean, his voice is heard by huge numbers of people. And because he's banging on about technology solving the problem, he's basically saying to the rest of the world, don't have to change your lifestyle. You can all aim to live like me, and we can solve it with a few bits of kit. And so that's my concern, is that message is very powerful, is sent out by the media, is loved by all the wealthy anyway, because they want to believe that, because it means they've got to change their lives. As the message I'm giving is heard by a handful of people in the odd room here and there. I see what you're saying, but I'm also concerned that the message they are giving is the one that is continually trotted back by the elites and wealthy in our society, because it's the one we all want to hear. We all want to hear that, don't we? We all want to hear there's a technical solution to this. We can carry on just doing what we're doing. So I see what you're saying, and I'm not 100% convinced. I'll have to think about it. Thanks.
Duncan?
Kevin, thanks very much, by the way. Really great talk. If we look at the top 10% or the top 1% globally,
Yeah.
and whether they're in China or in India, they're here, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And their emissions obviously are the problem. What's the fairest way to tackle that problem? In other words, is it some way a progressive carbon tax where the more carbon emissions you emit per year, or is this a ration system? What approach should one take? Because if that's the problem, and the richer you are, the greater the emissions you create, direct and indirect, because a lot of the investments you make go into carbon emissions.
Yeah, Piketty did try, they looked at that in their methodology investments as well. That was in there.
Yeah. So how do we tackle this problem?
Well, firstly, I think we have to recognise whatever we do, it's a rationing issue. We years ago, myself and some colleagues, and one particular colleague, we worked a lot on a rationing card, a personal carbon allowance. It was called domestic tradable quotas, which was an awful term, but basically a personal carbon allowance. And what people didn't like about it when we did some of the sort of social science survey work around it was they didn't like the term of rationing. But we were all rationed by our salary. Okay, we were allowed to borrow a bit here and there, and when the bankers were in a little while ago, we could borrow far too much. But by and large, we live our lives rationed by things, and yet we weren't allowed to use the word rationing. People didn't like this idea. But ultimately, when you've got a scarce resource, and it's a scarce resource which has been rapidly dwindling, then you are forced to ration. So then the question is, how do you ration? Not, should you be rationing? It inevitably is a ration. Other than one very important caveat, I don't particularly like carbon taxes. I think they have a niche role to play. I think prices have a niche role to play. The problem with prices, the scale of reductions that you're trying to get, the prices have to be very, very high, and that has big problems for people in poverty, well, for many poor people around the globe. So, and some work we've done on this previously, if we looked at aviation, we were looking at 300 euros a tonne. I don't know what it is at the moment. Is it 7 euros a tonne or something for a tonne of carbon? So we're looking at 300 euros a tonne, which everyone sort of laughed at the time. That made a 25% difference to the price of a flight. So you're going to go to Rome, it's going to cost you £100, it's going to cost you £125. Yeah, we're just going to go to Rome. People like us are still going to go to Rome. We're inelastic to the price of energy because we have far too much money to concern ourselves with energy prices. We might talk about it down the pub, but it doesn't affect our lives that much. So the problem with the price is you cannot make it high enough. We're looking at training shoes and things like that coming by ship. They'd have to be several thousand euros a tonne to make a difference to the price of training shoes. So you cannot put the price up high enough to make it viable without having huge destabilisation problems. The one, I think, exception to that is the sort of thing that Hanson's popularised, this fee and dividend. You come across this? This is where you charge a fee for the carbon, a carbon tax effectively, and you pay a carbon tax. That is all collected, and then it's divided out evenly amongst everyone. Sure. Now, that sounds quite good. Instead of saying, okay, fine, so that means the Americans will collect the tax, and then they would take a huge chunk of that and hand it over to India and to China. Politically, that sounds a bit challenging. I think they might have to hand it out within a nation. You can imagine it working. Across nations, I think there'd be real problems with it. So I think taxes have a role to play, but there are problems with them. So I personally like the idea of a carbon budget for nations, and within those carbon budgets, you then have some sort of carbon allowance scheme. That's my personal preference for being the fairest. There are a number of reasons for that. First, it's fairer, but the second thing, what it does, it drives innovation. Tax does not drive innovation that much. For tax, the wealthy, the early adopters, the people that drive the innovation process can afford to pay the tax. If you have a carbon allowance, even if you can buy some of that, because the carbon allowance is brought down every year, the rich are required to change how they live their lives. And that means they will be forcing Lamborghini to have very efficient cars and whatever four-wheel drive things and all the rest of it. So they drive the innovation process. So I think actually the carbon allowance process is much more dynamically appropriate than a carbon tax process, though a lot of economists disagree with me on that.
Okay, very quick, Declan, do you have some?
Where does nuclear power fit into your thinking?
Actually, I have some slides. I didn't put them up then. Nuclear power provides 2.5% of the world's final energy demand. So I'm quite specific about that. Of the energy we consume in our homes, our businesses, our transport, the energy we consume, 2.5% of the world's energy comes from nuclear power. That's 435 nuclear power stations around the globe. If you want nuclear, and it is very low, it's about 5 to 15 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. So it's about the same as renewables. It is about 10 to 15 times, if not more than that, lower than carbon capture and storage, and far lower than gas-fired. So it's very low carbon. If you wanted nuclear to provide, say, a significant contribution, so let's imagine 25% of current energy demand, not electricity, but of all energy, so you have to electrify cars and heating and so forth, 25% of that provided by nuclear, you'd have to build about 2,000 nuclear power stations, the same size as Sizewell B in the UK, so a fairly large power station, 1 to 1.5 gigawatts, 2,000 power stations in the next 20 to 30 years. We're building 70 at the moment, most of which are delayed and over budget. So you just do the basic maths on that. You cannot build your way out of it with big bits of kit. That's not to say it couldn't have a role to play. There are lots of other issues as well. Is there enough uranium-235? The industry, some say yes, some say no. Can you go to fast breeder reactors? Well, you can, but then you get lots of plutonium, which has a weapons-grade material. Do you want thousands of reactors around the world producing weapon-grade material? A normal power station, a normal single-through power station, nuclear power station, does not produce weapon-grade material. You cannot make a bomb out of it. You can make something that's dirty. It can send radiation all over the place, but you can't make a nuclear bomb. Once you've got plutonium, as someone told me recently, or a whole lot of nuclear people at an event I was at, if you've got plutonium and a ladder, you can make a bomb. They are the two ingredients you require. And if you have lots of fast breeder reactors, which are very attractive in lots of respects, they're more efficient, then all you require is a ladder. And you have lots of potential bombs all around the world. So nuclear has problems both from a proliferation point of view and from the fact you can't scale it up. But it could certainly be part of the response to climate change.
Okay, Kevin, I'm going to ask you to take a breather.
Yep.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask the respondents, if you don't mind coming up and sit here so you can use the case. I'll introduce you